All right, at this point, I hope everybody got through the Flow Control 1 section without any problems. Well, at least without any major problems. Hopefully you see the power of if statements and switch statements and how they give you the ability to add decision making into your applications. Obviously something that's very, very important when creating dynamic type programs. Now, the knowledge review. Yes, the final assignment may have been a little tricky. That's okay, though. We designed it that way. You may have had to go all the way back to some of the original Hyperion code to pull out the answer for some of it, but we wanted you to do that. And if you struggled and did not make it all the way to the end, that's okay. Don't panic, as long as you gave it a good try, and then when you watched us do the code, you thought to yourself, oh yeah, that's not as bad as I was picturing. So, now that we've got Flow Control 1 out of the way, let's go ahead and take a moment and get away from the language and see if we can put some of our new skills to use in another application. And there's no better place to do it than with a game. So it's time to get back into some game design. We're going to take a look at a very simple game called Canon. Now, before we talk about Canon, let's take just a minute and kind of rewind all the way back to the beginning of this course and recap where we're at. We started out with the Hyperion project. Now, the Hyperion project was our version of a Hello World application. Granted, it was far more sophisticated than a standard Hello World application, but it served two very important purposes to us. Number one, it allowed us to introduce you to the world of game design without even touching a computer. Just how do we pull out a piece of paper and design a game? We were able to take the Hyperion project, divide it up into two major sections, the engine and a level that was put together by an artistic level designer, and then we walked through the process of actually getting it coded once we had a spec put together on paper. And then once we got it coded, we brought a level designer in, and the level designer created an actual game for it. Very cool process. So that was the first part of the idea of showing the Hyperion project. The second part was we wanted you to get your hands dirty. We were not looking for you to understand every piece of code as you typed in what we typed in. We just wanted you to become familiar with watching your casing, watching how you had your code formatting, using things like terminators and commas and open parentheses and closing parentheses. Everything that we used, we wanted you just to get familiar with this world. That's all. Now, as I said, as we worked our way through the Hyperion project, don't panic if you don't know what you're doing. It will all start to come together later. Now that we've got some basic language fundamentals underneath our belt, let's see if we can put some of this to use in a way that you can kind of follow along with what's taking place. Now, let's go ahead and focus on Canon. What are we going to be doing here? Well, we're going to be creating a very simple game. Now, right now, you may be thinking, well, let me see the game. I want to see the final result. What am I building? No. I'm going to treat you guys like real game developers. Think about it. When id Software set out to create Doom, they did not have somebody walk into their first meeting and go, hey guys, check it out. Here's my laptop. I've got Doom running on it right now. I want everybody to take a look because this is what we're going to make. All right, check it. It's pretty cool. Look at the amp. Look at the shotgun. All right. You see how that? Look how he's going from room to room. We didn't have that. They didn't have that. Why should we give this to you? We're not. Basically, what they did is they all sat down around a table and said, all right, let's make a game that does the following. And they started to put together a requirement for the game. You could look at it that way. And from there, they ended up coming up with a specification for the game. And they just went forward and forward, and probably an iterative process to come up with the final result that we have all played, well, way back in the day. And maybe some of you more recently. But the bottom line is they didn't get to see the game before they coded it. And you guys are not going to get to see Canon before you code it because I want you to go through the entire process here. We're going to walk through the software development process. We're going to take a look at the requirements for the game. We're going to look at the design plan. We're going to put together an implementation plan. Then we're going to code it. As we go through all of this, basically the simple whiteboarding that I'm going to do is going to help define what this game should look like. And you're going to get a picture of it in your mind. Now, as we progress all the way through to the end, when we have a final playable result, I'm hoping that you guys go, yeah, that looks exactly what I had imagined, all the way back to the original meeting with the developers, and we set out to design that particular game. So that is the plan with Canon. Now, you'll notice we've got on the screen here Canon 1, Canon 2, and Canon 3. Now, we're going to define the requirements of the Canon game, and we're going to put together the design plan of Canon but we're going to implement it 3 times. We're going to implement it once for WinForms, so we're going to use an event-driven model, which is exactly what you guys saw when we created the button bouncing around the screen. It was all relying on events. When the mouse moved into the button, when the mouse moved out of the button, how we changed the text, how when we pressed the button, we got that click event that took place. It was all event-driven. Basically, the window was sitting there waiting on events to occur and process those events as they occurred. Okay? So we're going to take a look at creating Canon that way, something that you should be sort of familiar with. From there, we're going to move into Canon 2, where Canon 2 is going to be implemented differently, though using the same requirement and design specs. So you're going to get to see some really cool stuff here. When we implement Canon 2, we're going to implement it with an actual but simple game engine, and it's going to be an object-oriented engine. And the neat thing about it, as a matter of fact, if I pull my pen out right here, the neat thing about this simple engine design is that it is going to mimic Canon 3, which is going to utilize the XNA framework. And of course, with Canon 3, we're going to start out with a template that the XNA framework provides for you to start your game from. And you're going to find that with Canon 2, the engine that we put together is going to look very, very familiar. What's nice about Canon 2 is when designing this, you're doing it from ground up, from scratch. When we start out in the XNA world, we get this framework already established for us. And if you hadn't already visited all of the methods, it may appear very foreign or extremely cryptic, if nothing else. By going in here and taking a look at an engine design from ground up, but designing it in such a way that it is very similar to what the XNA framework looks like, when we move over into Canon 3 and implement it with the XNA framework, things are going to look a lot more familiar to you. So that is the plan. Now, for us to get from Canon 1 over to Canon 2, we're going to have to throw in at least one video where we are going to talk about object orientation. We at least need to introduce you to classes and then once again define data members. We need to define properties, and we need to define methods for you. This is very important. This is not going to be our object-oriented, focused lessons. That's going to come up in Volume 2 of this XNA Extreme course. We just need to introduce you to the concepts so that when we put together our object-oriented engine, you're not going to feel lost, okay? And also, of course, when we move over to Canon 3, everything's heavily object-oriented. You're not going to feel lost. So that is our plan of attack here. It may seem like there's a lot going on, and there is, but just take it one video at a time. Take it slowly, and I promise you, it'll all start to fall in place. Now, I'll go ahead and warn you ahead of time. Canon 2 and Canon 3 may feel a bit confusing to you. Once again, just like with the Hyperion project, follow along. Try to absorb everything that you can. You've got a lot of language fundamentals under your belt now. So believe it or not, most of it is going to make sense. Things that don't make sense are slowly going to be addressed in future videos in this course. And as those things are addressed, of course, they will be reapplied to other games, just reinforcing what it is you've learned. So once again, if some of the concepts seemed a little bit confusing, just hang in there. I promise you, it's all going to come together. Hopefully by now, a lot of things have come together if you are new to programming and after going through the Hyperion project and then all of the fundamental videos that we've provided. Whew, all right, lots of talking. Logan, is there anything you want to add here?
No, not really. I think that pretty much covers it.
All right. Well, with that, let me do this. We're not done yet because getting a game design in place, there's a thing called the software development process, and this is very important to us. So let me go ahead and bring focus up here in case I need a whiteboard, which I sure I am. All right, in putting together any application, you must have a plan. Now, it's fine to sit down behind Visual Studio and just start tinkering with basic ideas or simple algorithms to see if you can get, simple results out of a program. But do not pull up Visual Studio and try to write the next Space Invaders or Galaga or, the Unreal Engine without some sort of serious, well-defined plan. If you do, you're going to end up wanting to take your head and slam it against your desk over and over because it will end up becoming a nightmare in your head. By having a good plan in place, the development process will go much smoother. Now, when you start talking about software development processes, one of the words that come up is, what model are you going to use? There are several different software development models available that have been defined by different developers over the years. In our particular case here, we're going to focus on a very simple model that doesn't lend itself well to medium to complex games, but will work perfect for a game as simple as Canon. And this model is called the waterfall. So I'm going to go ahead and jot that down. So the waterfall model, I just want to give myself a break from talking. I've been doing so much talking here. So the waterfall model looks like this. Here's a waterfall, a side view. So, it doesn't really sound like waterfall sound effects, but basically it is a very sequential development process. That is the key thing here. And you can see it over here. As we develop, so as we work our way through our development process, everything is going to take place linearly. Once we have defined the requirements for our game, we will not revisit this section, okay? Once we have defined the design of our game, we will not revisit this section. Obviously, you can see with more sophisticated games, an iterative design process becomes very important. In our particular case, we're not going to do that. We're going to use the waterfall model. We're simply going to progress forward because it is a very simple game. And I believe by the time we get to the end of all of the Canon videos, everybody's going to go, oh yeah, of course, it's pretty straightforward. It's not a lot of code here. So we'll start out by defining the requirements of the Canon game. Once we've got the requirements defined, we will then move into the design phase. Now that we know what the game's all about, what elements do we need? What are the game rules that we're going to need in place to pull off the requirements that we've set for ourselves? Once we've got the design phase complete, we're then going to move over into an implementation plan. Think of it like this. The implementation plan is sort of like a roadmap for the coding process of our game. So the implementation plan is going to start getting some of our method names into place, because by the time we get done with the design phase, we're going to have an idea as to, well, the enemy needs to move. The player needs to be able to fire a projectile. We need some basic collision checking. So we can start to put together some of the method names that we're going to use. So we can really rough out what the code's going to look like on paper. Just, again, it's an implementation plan, so it's going to serve as a roadmap. Once we have that into place, the next thing we're going to do is the fun part. We're going to code it. We're going to program it and make it actually work. Once we get that in place, we're then going to move on to the next phase, which is going to be the test and debugging phase. It's also known as the verification phase. Why verification? Everybody has their own thoughts as to what this means, but I'll tell you what verification means. It means we're going to verify that our application accomplishes what our requirements set out for us to accomplish. So, here's what I'm talking about, and here's how this ties into test and debugging. Let's say that we have an enemy coming down our screen, we fire a projectile, the projectile hits the enemy, and the game crashes. Well, I'm here to bet you that the requirements of the game did not specify when you shoot the enemy, make the game explode. I bet that's not in there. So even though that is a bug somewhere, this all falls back to we are verifying that our final coded application matches our requirements. Once we get everything tested, debugged, and we have verified that it does indeed match the requirements, the next two things are installation and deployment, and finally any maintenance that is required. We're not going to be focusing on these two steps with Game Design 1. There's no reason to. We are focusing on the sheer game development in Canon 1. As we progress into some of the later games, we're then going to start talking about installation, deployment, and maintenance plans of attack. So this right now, it's all game design. So I want us to go through the requirements, the design, the implementation, the coding, and the testing. All of that is what is important right now. Now, hopefully, you've seen as I've gone through here with a pen and I've marked my way through each of these different steps, you can see how it's like a waterfall. How we trickle down one ledge of rocks to the next ledge of rocks, to the next. We never go back up. This right here you don't really look at it as going back up. Look at it as having the requirements printed out and right beside you, and you're making sure that you are accomplishing with your program what the requirements say.
But the key there is that no matter what you find in the testing and debugging phase, it's not going to allow you to change the requirements.
That's correct.
It's still a one-way process where you must change the code at that point to accommodate the requirements, not the other way around.
Precisely. So again, some of you guys out there, as new software engineers, I want you to start becoming familiar with some of the software development models that are out there, and here is your first introduction to one. This is a waterfall model, founded back in, I think it was in the early 1970s. Again, it's a very popular method with simple applications, but with more sophisticated applications that tend to change as the application is being written, you would not dare want to use a waterfall model because it's simply not going to work. Because let's say you're in the middle of coding it and you decide, hey, we need to change this, that. Well, that needs to go back into the design phase and the implementation phase. It might even go as far back as affecting the requirements of the original application. It all depends. These get into different software development models. And again, we'll see if we can introduce some of those as we progress through this course. So just keep in mind, the model that we're using is the waterfall model. Whew, lots of talking. So with all of that out of the way, let us go ahead and get started with the requirements and the design phase of the Canon game. Because as I said a few minutes ago, these two right here are going to remain the same through Canon 1, Canon 2, and Canon 3. The only thing that's going to differ is the implementation and, of course, the code. Okay? So with that out of the way, it's time for us to get busy. Thanks a lot, guys.